Sawyer.
Okay, dang it. All right, here we go.
Okay, Jen, do you want to go ahead and get us started with an intro?
Who, me?
Yes.
Am I supposed to do that?
Yes, just an intro to Ginny, her project, and you introduce the committee members.
Okay, so hi, everybody in Zoom space. I'm Jen Wright. I am a psychology professor at the College of Charleston. I am the thesis advisor for Virginia McCown on her MES thesis defense, which is happening today. We are joined by Jennifer Saunders, who is currently teaching middle schoolers.
High schoolers.
High schoolers.
High school, earth science.
Awesome. Dr. Martin Jones, who has left us behind for the mountains of New Mexico. Omar Muhammad, who is joining us from Low Country Alliance for Model Communities, and who is very central to the project that we're going to be talking about today, or that Ginny's going to be talking about. And of course, Virginia herself is here to tell us a little bit about her project. The title of which is, you tell us.
It is From Hosting Environmental Justice Academies to Direct Community Engagement, How Activism is Influenced by the Fluidity of Community Involvement.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just gonna give you guys a quick heads up. I'm gonna do just give you a background of environmental justice, what it is, how communities are affected by it, what this research attempted to understand, and then what the data revealed and its future implications. So when we look at environmental justice, we focus on environmentally vulnerable communities, excuse me.
Ginny, your slides, you're not sharing your slides yet.
I'm not?
Nope.
What am I showing?
Just us here.
My apologies.
Okay.
Thought it was.
There we go.
Yay. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. So there's the rundown again. Just going to give you guys some environmental justice information, how communities are affected by it, what this research attempted to understand, and then what the data revealed and future implications going forward. So when we talk about environmental justice, we focus on environmentally vulnerable communities. Did it again. Vulnerability is defined as a community's coping capacity to withstand potential loss and harm during a crisis. There are many factors that go into making a community vulnerable. So a person's age, race, gender, occupation, access to resources. And statistically, what we see is that minority and low-income communities have a higher exposure to environmental injustices. We can measure vulnerability through the Social Vulnerability Index, designed by Susan Cutter, who's a leading expert in social vulnerability. And it was actually adapted for the US, but it's all over the world now, and people are using it everywhere. The leading agency, of course, is the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is their definition for environmental justice. No group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. It goes on to talk about the fair treatment of meaningful involvement through all people. So the vulnerable population I was just speaking of, this is them and everyone. And I think it's important, I wanted to tell you guys the difference when we look at equality, environmental justice as equality. It kind of diverts. So everybody wants equality, but that relies on everyone being in the same space. So financially, health-wise, geographically, that we're all equal, which obviously we are all not. So instead, we kind of need to shift to looking at equity. And you can see in the illustration, so they all have the same box on the left, but what the two other people obviously need is a little bit more help. So when we look at equity, it kind of gives us more of an idea of who needs more resources, who needs more assistance, and just that extra little leg up. So movements happen all the time. Obviously, the civil rights movement was a huge movement that happened in the 1950s and 60s. And so laws try for equality. They don't always get there, though, as seen in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, freedom for slavery, equal rights, and then voting rights. They attempted equality, but then there's all the caveats. So Jim Crow's laws decriminalized segregation and kind of diverted the two populations between African Americans and white and separated us essentially up until the civil rights movement. So now there is a history of environmental justice movement. And this began, a lot of people say, I mean, I'm sure there were many more situations, but the real inauguration of environmental justice happened in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina. The Ward Transformer Company dumped a whole bunch of chemicals on the roadsides of North Carolina. And to remediate it, the state got together and decided they needed to move all the chemicals. And they had two counties they could choose. So it's either going to be Warren County, which was privately owned. So they had no voting rights, no mayor, no city council, nothing, no control, basically. It was 60% African Americans, with 25% of them falling below the poverty line. Now, Chatham County was the other county that the state was considering. They were publicly owned, so citizens had some sort of power over the decision making. They were only 27% African American, and only 6 fell below the poverty line. So you can imagine which one was chosen. Once the NAACP found out about this, they came down. There was a huge protest. 500 people were arrested, and some say that this was the inauguration of the environmental justice movement that continues today. So even though the EPA has their definition of what environmental justice is, minority and low-income communities really carry the brunt of all the environmental injustices that happen. As a matter of fact, it's up to 95th and 99th percentile. It's a lot. Another example of this was seen in Flint, Michigan. Real quick, I know everybody knows about this. 2014, the local government, in an attempt to save money, they diverted the water supply to Flint from the Detroit, Michigan River to a smaller community water system. Unfortunately, the pipes were so old, they leached lead into the water. There's pictures of it here. And I guess the idea was that nobody was going to do anything, again, because there's 61% African American and 41% fall below the poverty line. So you've got the race income thing happening again. And the assumption is that they won't react, they won't do anything. However, Flint, Michigan, because initially the government said that they had no liability, that it was not their fault, they weren't going to do anything. So in retaliation, the Flint, Michigan citizens got together and they produced an online database where they could get their blood samples taken and then upload them to this database to see exactly how toxic everything was. And it was. And some of the water, as you can see, was actually classified as toxic waste when it was tested. So once the government found out and saw these toxic blood results, they actually sent bottled water there for what, a year or two until the pipes could be replaced. So citizen action. So what we're seeing here, like when environmental justices occur, we have low income and minority communities. They're subjected to poor environmental conditions. They need environmental justice protection, but they lack the appropriate social, human, financial capital. And they're basically invisible to the outside population. People don't want to deal with it. They know whatever needs to happen is going to take money and time, and they're just basically invisible, or they're kept invisible, they're made invisible. And that's due to their lack of income, which circles back around to why they have the poor environmental conditions. And one thing to study when we look at vulnerability in these vulnerable communities is resiliency. So a community's exposure to environmental hazards requires an activation of community resiliency. And this is an amalgam of attributes and obstacles. We measure it just like the vulnerability. We measure it preparedness, placement attachment, collective efficacy, social trust, and leadership. And the Environmental Justice Academy, it started by the EPA, was to promote this leadership, was to promote resiliency through leadership in their communities. So it was started in 2016 in Atlanta, Georgia, like again, I say through the EPA. It's a 9-month course offered over, you go down once a month, spend the weekend, and it's offered in Region 4. And the main idea behind the Environmental Justice Academy, oh, I'm sorry, I've got 2 screens going, sorry, y'all. There it is, the Environmental Justice Academy, which promotes resiliency through leadership. So the idea is that there's a 9-month course. People go down once a month. There are 9 modules they learn, and it's through Region 4 of the EPA. The idea for the Environmental Justice Academy, is empowerment. So we're trying to empower communities with the knowledge and the leadership that they need to fight against these vulnerabilities, to fight all these unfair injustices that they're susceptible to. And it unites stakeholders. So it gets all the people together, the community, outside stakeholders, academics, researchers, politicians, just everybody involved, and unites them all. So one of the techniques they do this through is the collaborative problem solving model. I'm getting ahead of myself. And it's basically what you see. So we got to identify the issues. What exactly are people facing? We need to build their leadership through development and capacity building. We need dispute resolution, unites multi-stakeholders together. There's relevant, constructive engagement by relevant stakeholders, management and implementation, and evaluation finally. Let's see. So one of the tools we can use through the leadership program is community-based participatory research. Now this positions with all the other stakeholders, academics, politicians, activists, like you see, it positions the community as the nucleus. These are the ones, and research shows us that the residents of a community are the ones that know that community. Nobody from the outside. I mean, they need intervention and they need help and assistance. But if we're really going to get to know what a community needs, what its goals are, what its objectives are, what its culture is, then we need to go to the community and the residents within it. So we hosted an Environmental Justice Academy. Got with Omar, the president of Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. He graduated from the EGA in 2016. I believe he was one of the first ones. My committee member, and he's also a graduate of Train the Trainer class. So we decided to bring, or he decided to bring, and I jumped on the back of him, the first EGA Academy to Charleston. And again, we focused on activists, community leaders, students, politicians, anyone really with a vested interest in environmental justice for their community. And you can see over here, LAMC, the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities, serves 7 communities, and just in reference to Charleston. So the first community had low attendance. The second community had low attendance as well, but we still held it, and it was great. I enjoyed it. And it ended up talking about equality and equity, goal setting, leadership, logic model, and grant writing. So after the low attendance for the first and the second EJA, we were deciding what to do with the third one, but then COVID struck. So what we had to do was somewhat pivot, and obviously there's no large gatherings happening. So what we wanted to do was kind of shift the focus and still keep the work going, but go to the community and do more of a one-on-one research program. So the research goal then became, or the research question, excuse me, what are the best practices for fighting environmental, social, and health inequities that involve communities in a meaningful, substantive, contributing role as participants in their own defense? So we chose Gigi. Gigi Gadsden Green is a community in downtown Charleston. It's been around for 200 years. As you can see in the bottom left, this is what it used to be. You can see President Street. To the right is actually Gadsden Green Creek. So the creek has now been filled in, but I think this is 1872. It was swimming, it was recreational. People used it for commercial fishing. They did baptisms in it. I love this picture. But once the community, the Gadsden Green Creek itself, was seized by the city, they filled it with a bunch of landfill and just not good stuff, and covered it for land development later. So now this is what's left of the Gadsden Green community. It's a community project. I believe we said it was 264 residents. Yeah. So the next step, excuse me, I lost my place. So now we wanted to go, because of COVID, like I said, we still wanted to go and figure out the community needs, like what the community wanted. This community needs lots of love. It's been pushed to the side. It's been exploited. It's been forgotten, but they need our assistance. So what we wanted to do was go to the community, do a more one-on-one approach, and really get to know what the community wanted. And so we tried to get an idea of the past, present, and future perspectives. We did doorstep, COVID friendly. We had 2 girls. Tenova Robinson, we work with her. She's the director, or the former director, excuse me, of Gadsden Green, and she knew 4 of the residents who helped us. So we hired them on with the help of Jen's grant. And so we were able to compensate them, and we went door to door and just asking people what they wanted, what they thought of Gadsden Green, what they wanted for Gadsden Green, what they saw for the future of Gadsden Green. And we collected over 100 interviews. So this was our quick survey. Again, looking through it, we collected names and addresses. Just we don't use them obviously to keep anonymity, but just for our own purposes. How long have you lived in Gadsden Green? Has the community changed since you moved here? I'm asking them to name 3 challenges. So obviously, has it changed since you moved here as a past? We asked them to name 3 challenges for the present. And then in the future, what immediate changes they would like to see, what changes they'd like to see in the next 5 to 10 years. Excuse me. And if there was anything else they'd like to say about Gigi. And this is what we found. So the girls that we worked with were awesome. I think they did a great job. However, I think this question could have been elaborated on a lot more, and I'll tell you. So 51% of the people that we interviewed said that Gigi had not changed. But we don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Like I would have liked to have been there to ask them, well, how is it? I mean, is that a good thing? Do you think it's okay that it hasn't changed? Do you think it should have changed? So the only 2 questions, or the only 2 answers that I really like here are yes, it's for the better, and yes, it's worse, unfortunately. Because if someone says yes, without any elaboration, and it only says neutral just for our purposes, they just said yes on the sheet. So we still don't know, is that good? Is that bad? The 2 unsure, the 2% were 2 girls who had just moved here. It were 2 separate, they didn't move together, but they were 2 girls, and they just basically said, I don't know, I haven't been here long enough. And then what was the other one? Yes or no. So let's say that right now. Anyway, let's see. So the next question we asked them were the 3 main challenges that they face on a daily basis. And as you can see, and so this is just for this one particular question. We didn't add them all together yet. So fighting and gun violence, 51 people said that was an issue. Maintenance and housing is 31, trash, and so on and so forth. For immediate changes, again, housing is number 1, and less violence is tied with it. Let's see. Long-term goals, again, we're seeing maintenance and less violence as 3rd and 4th, but it's interesting because the first one, the coming together of as a community. What we saw a lot in the data was that people didn't know their neighbors. They didn't talk to them. They didn't get to know them. They weren't close to them. So lack of like a sense of community became a real issue, and one of the main themes that we saw resounding throughout the data. Another one, the I'll be gone next, was they just didn't even want to stay in Gigi. They didn't want to contemplate long-term goals. They didn't want to think about what was going to happen. They just wanted to be gone. Again, maintenance next, and then less violence and more peace next. And this is resounding throughout, as you can see here. So the 5 main themes that we saw emerge from the data: crime and violence were huge. Housing and maintenance were huge. Those were really the top 3. The lack of sense of community, again, comes from people not knowing their neighbors. There's no camaraderie. There's no neighborly. They don't hang out. There's nothing bringing them together. Community needs like gardens, just cleanliness, more or less. I think, excuse me. Anything the community needs. And then we had flooding. Flooding was a huge issue, but that's a Charleston thing. So the 5 main groups were statistically analyzed to see if there was any statistical significance between any of them. And what we found with a 2-sample pair t-test was that crime and housing were statistically significant, as well as community needs and housing. And let me go back and I'll explain more of that. Community needs. Sorry, y'all. Community needs. Okay, so yeah, so community needs. They need a better atmosphere. People said people in the office need to be more vigilant. The reps need to take action. Like these are all, again, going back, they need activities for kids. What basically any community I feel like would need. So the crime and the housing were statistically significant, as well as the community needs and housing. And between the top 5 topics, the 2 that recurred the most, which we'll talk about more too, is crime and housing. And crime was drugs, violence, gun violence. Actually, when we first started doing this, there was a shooting at one of the stores. So that kind of came up, and that was, I'm sure, on everybody's forefront. And then housing. Housing is a big issue. And it's not just, I mean, it is maintenance and stuff, but it's also renovations and just upkeep. When we look at correlations, these are pretty obvious. We found a positive correlation between negative changes and crime. Obviously, if somebody says, yes, there have been negative changes, I'm not a fan of it, it's probably because crime is going up. The same with housing. If the housing is not doing good, it probably means that they have community needs. We found a negative correlation in crime and a lack of sense of community. Again, if crime is going up, you're probably going to see people just not feeling close to their neighbors, feeling very isolated, and not reaching out to anybody. And then community needs and negative change. So as the needs go up, they do see a lot of negative change too. So then we ran the binomial test, and this is to show, so if we wanted to see the difference between what constitutes a community need and what constitutes an individual need, just to say, somebody didn't just say, yes, this is what I'm facing, but to look at it as a whole community. So if we set the frequency at 50% and say, okay, if this is a real community need, then we need 50% of the population to say that it is. And when we set it at 50, we found that crime was 64% of the time mentioned, housing and maintenance 65, and a lacking a sense of community 58. So setting it at 50%, that is definitely significant and a community issue. When we lower it and say, okay, well, maybe only if 10% of the people of the population say that this is an issue, we can put that in there too. And we did that, all 5 of our 5 main themes are relevant here. So community needs and flooding as well. And because the former charts, that's kind of why I zoomed through them. There was a miscommunication earlier, but the former charts I simply put down for each question, but I think it's important to look here at the whole mention. So for all the questions that we asked for the survey, how many times was each of the 5 categories mentioned? And let me move y'all because I can't really see this. So when you look at crime and violence, 135% of the time, crime and violence was mentioned. And the number of residents that mentioned it was 64. Again, some in the housing, 150% of the time, housing was mentioned. And that, you know, with the interviews, so if we asked about the 3 main challenges, sometimes if they didn't say crime, they might say it for long term or for the short term. What would you like to see in the long term? Well, I'd like to see less crime, even though they didn't mention in the challenges or anywhere else in the survey. So this is basically summarizing every time somebody mentioned one of the 5 themes. Sorry, I got to move on again. So lack of community, 101% of the time, community needs 23% of the time, and flooding, 20. Significant. Oh, excuse me. So we've got all this data, and the purpose of it is we had actually 3 purposes that we want to use it for. The first, going back to our Environmental Justice Academy, which we still want to host, I would love to be a part of it. So because Omar has graduated with the Train the Trainer and he's been through the EGA, he knows how to shape an Environmental Justice Academy towards a specific community. So when we hosted the Environmental Justice Academy here, the 9-month module, and then, you know, there's a fee involved, there's an application involved. We just didn't think Charleston was quite ready for that kind of commitment. So we did kind of shrink it down a little bit to the first one was a 3-day, the second was a 1-day. But going forward, now that we've collected all this data, when we are able to regroup and come together as a community, we can shape a specific Environmental Justice Academy towards Gadsden Green and like their specific needs. such as the 5 themes that we just saw. When I was interviewing Omar for my paper, he actually said he's got one community where they need racial sensitivity training. You know, not every community needs that, but because they're about to be integrated and there's, I guess, a change going through it, that they actually have to have racial sensitivity training there. I don't think that would happen at Gigi. I wouldn't imagine that would happen anywhere. But my point is, each neighborhood needs a specific thing. Again, going back to that community-based participatory research, we need to know exactly what that community needs, and that way we can shape our teachings to their needs. So that's one of the purposes. The other, when we were given these interviews, we got a lot of short answers. We got a lot of yes, no's, a lot of blanks. But then there were a couple girls, when I was lucky enough to be there, who just rambled. And they had so much to say, and they were so articulate and so invested and so passionate about it. So the second purpose, we can identify these people and possibly reach out to them again so that they can help us with the next round, or they can help us reach out to the community and get more, like a higher participation, which is what we need for the academies. And we're also using it for a third purpose. So we're accumulating all this data to present to city officials and the decision makers who make choices for Gadsden Green. And this includes the Charleston Housing Authority. Oops, excuse me. Yeah. So the 2 main themes that we actually saw through the data, housing and violence and crime. And what you see here is, this is actually down at Gigi. It's a separated 2 apartments that they've emptied out. On one side is going to be a substation for the Charleston County Police Department. And they're using the 2 apartments, one for their side, and then the other side they're going to use, and this was Tanova's suggestion, as an access center. And the data that we're actually collecting now for the second round of interviews is what everybody, like what the residents of Gigi would like to see go in that access center. There's a couple of options I think we've been talking about. MUSC has a CARES clinic where they do just basic medical, they do immunizations and, you know, tests for flu and just simple evaluations and possible referrals. So that's possibly one, an idea that can go on the other side. It could be a computer lab or research lab somewhere people can go for technology resources. And I think they were talking about possible mental health as well, having someone in there who could help people, not just medically, but with their mental and emotional health. And then for the second theme, the second larger theme that we saw were housing issues. And this part was difficult because a lot of people have just inhumane living conditions. The first time we went out there, there was a mosquito issue that I think it was September, October, so there shouldn't have even been that many mosquitoes, but they were just swarms and swarms of them to an unhealthy, inhumane kind of degree. So what we're doing is collecting data too, trying to get anecdotal stories, pictures, anything that we can get to present to the Charleston Housing Authority so that they can actually see what the residents at GG are dealing with. I think one of the girls that interviewed with us or conducted the interviews, her bathtub is falling through her ceiling and she can't get anybody to come out and look at it. So it's pretty severe circumstances these people are dealing with. So in conclusion, so we have vulnerable communities. We have these people who are invisible. They lack the visibility. They lack the funds. They lack the capital. And what we would like to do is actually, you know, go in and figure out what they need and help them. Residents in the communities are the most knowledgeable. If we're going to understand them and give them true assistance, then we need to get to know the community. We need to build trust. We need to build relationships. There's an example in my paper. In Nepal, they taught these women how to go out in these rural areas and be midwives. But in Nepal, single women can't travel. So they were kind of shunned and pushed aside because no one understood that that culture won't allow single women to travel. So people can try to help and there can be assistance programs, but if we don't know the actual community that we're trying to assist, it could be futile. It could actually possibly cause more damage than good. So I think actually getting in the community and understanding what we're doing and what we're trying to attempt to do is huge. We use Gadsden Green for the next hopeful round of environmental justice academies and to get to know their needs and what they wanted to present to city officials, possibly do more good. And the data that we're going to keep using, we're going to, for the CPD substation, and take it to the Charleston Housing Association and hopefully do some good. I love this last quote. So I saw her continually through my research, and she said, communities are made and not born. So thank y'all. Thank y'all.
Good job.
So I would assume, Lucy, if you have questions, it would be appropriate at this time for you to ask them.
Thanks. I have a few.
Sure.
Really good job. I actually was very excited because I had heard a little bit about Gadsden Green, but not the history really of it. So this was really informational. That was good. So my questions are very unorganized, but so I'll start with people who don't intend to be here long, because you said a significant portion of that, over 30% maybe.
Yeah.
So don't intend to be there much longer, so they wouldn't really communicate future goals. How will that impact the Environmental Justice Academy approach and building goals for the future if you think there's going to be short-term residents?
Well, that's the hard part, because if we don't have participants for community-based participatory research, then
Right.
It's kind of counteractive. And I actually do go deeper in my paper concerning that. I hope that there's maybe, I mean, I know if people want to move out, that obviously they want to if they're unhappy, but I think building a sense of pride, that seems to be what these, the residents there lack. And I should have mentioned that in my lacking community, but they don't feel like, I don't think they really care a lot about the community. So going back to the mosquitoes example, like Jen started, she got people out there, the mosquitoes are gone. This is the thing. If we can start building up their community and instill more pride and trust for outside interventions, I think maybe people will want to stay around. It's a great area. I mean, it needs some love, but there's some really cool people out there. And I understand how people would be frustrated and saying, I don't even want to be here. I'm not even thinking about it. I'll be gone. Because I've got one girl that I spoke with, and she aspires to Section 8 housing. That's her aspiration. So I think all the help we can give them and just building that sense of community and that sense of pride and working with that. And I think that comes from safety. And I think it comes from aesthetics, unfortunately, and living in a safe house. The girl that her bathtub is falling through the ceiling, she's got 7 kids. That doesn't make anybody want to sit around and stay. So right. If people want to go, maybe they'll be around long enough where we can show them that we can make Gigi better. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So I think I was just confused, maybe just on terminology. So you talked about interviews, and I know COVID impacted the ability for you to give a lot of the interviews. So you asked, who were the 2 people that gave interviews?
No, we got 100 interviews.
But who did them? Didn't you say it was someone that wasn't associated with you all, or?
No. There were 4. I'm sorry, that was my mistake. I rushed. I was 4 residents. So Tanova's the former director of Gadsden Green. She's no longer with them. But she knew 4 girls who had actually shown an interest in community outreach and help. So we hired them on with the grant money that Jen provided. And so they would go out. They had 2 recorders and a notebook, and I went with them and once. And so we would go out and just interview, and they knocked out 100 interviews, which is a substantial portion for 264 people. So they were part of it. And that's with the next round of interviews that we're conducting, that's actually what we're lacking right now, because Tanova is no longer there. I'll be down there this weekend, and I'm hoping if they see my face enough times that maybe they'll start trusting me. I'm just gonna possibly be a constant there. And see, Tanova does have a cousin who still works or who still lives there. So she's gonna try to put her in touch with me, and maybe she'll want to work with me. I don't know, Tanova might be out for a little while. We just found out yesterday. So I'm not sure how that's gonna go down, but yeah.
Cool. Well, that sounds really awesome. And I just want you to sort of expand a little bit on because I know the environmental justice academies are not necessarily taught by people in the community, whereas this is actually where you're getting surveys and interviews from people in the community. Can you expand a little bit how that impacts the answers and the responses that you get and the level of engagement that you get?
What do you mean, like, because we're talking directly with the residents?
So yeah, I guess in both senses you are, but for the Environmental Justice Academy, it is, you don't necessarily live in the community and you're giving sort of the mentorship. Whereas with the interviews, it was someone who lives in that same housing, asking them about housing. So maybe more relatable, but how do you think that impacts the answers and the response rate that you get?
It's huge. It's huge because in the EJAs, I mean, we did have, so the first time we didn't have anybody show up. The second time we had 10 people show up, but they were already affiliated with like environmental justice organizations or climate activism or some sort of community program. So, and we didn't really inquire. We taught the whole, or Omar, forgive me, taught just the whole entire academy. Just pick, you know, those 5 main topics that I talked about, the equality and goal setting and grant writing and stuff, kind of an overall thing. But I think because we don't have the resources yet to host a 9-month to where we can actually teach the entire thing, the entire curriculum that was laid out by the EPA. I think it's important to be able to shape it and modify it specifically for a community so we're not wasting anybody's time. You know, again, I would have never thought racial sensitivity would need to be taught, but Omar knows the community. I can't remember the name of it. That's my fault right now, but the one he's working with, he knows, he's gone in, he understands them, he's spoken with them. He knows they need a little bit of focus on one particular area. So if we're going to not have the time, that if people don't have the time to invest the entirety for the EJA, I think it's important that while we have them and while we can talk to them and while we can do outreach, is to shape it so that it's particular to them. So it's community specific. And I think that's what we get when we ask one-on-one interviews, as opposed to teaching a whole entire curriculum. If we know what they want to know, then we can teach them.
Awesome. I like that.
Is that right? Is that okay? I didn't know if that explained.
No, that was good. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the difference. Okay, I have one question and then I'll stop.
Please.
So one of the things you mentioned before, that you lack some of the resources, and I know you mentioned a little bit about grants. Can you talk about how EGA actually acquires resources and funding for this?
I cannot, because I don't know that one. I just know what Jen tells me, and I haven't gotten that far. I was listening to the grant writing portion, but Jen just said we have money and we need to hire people, and we said okay. Like, I don't know. I know that's terrible, and that
I just was trying to think of it, if it's all grant based, or if there's government support, or if it's that could also be the same thing if it's a government grant. Yeah. How exactly that works in terms of literally community growth and engagement and empowerment.
Well, I know the last time when I defended last year, Omar mentioned the amount of grants that LAMC was receiving because of this. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a portion in my thesis where we talk about at the end, and I really should have put that in there now that I'm thinking about it. There's so much grant money out there that the EPA puts aside for stuff like this that I don't think it would be difficult if you knew the way to do it, to apply and receive grants like that. But maybe Jen knows more about that than I do. I haven't gotten that far.
And perhaps things have changed based on, like, you know, previous administration and current administration, because I think like there has been some sorry, Omar, I remember Omar was saying something before about how some I mean, there were resources that are kind of like were disappeared or hidden, and some I don't know.
Some a lot of money. I know
of yeah, getting around that, or yeah.
No, okay, now this is my real final question, and then I'll stop.
I'm good now.
I'm also just curious. So I think this is really interesting, and I think with COVID-19, there are communities that are now at risk that have really never been at risk before, and there are communities experiencing food insecurity that really have no experience with that at all. Mm-hmm. And I think it's become more of a problem as opposed to segregating, okay, well, this can only happen to people who are in poverty. No, now with a pandemic, it can happen. We know that it can happen to almost anyone. So how do you think the approach to environmental justice and the openness to environmental justice will change with this pandemic?
I think there'll be a lot more people in that category of low income. I think their visibility, like we talked about, them lacking social capital, financial capital, visibility capital, I think that will probably be diminished because there'll be more people who didn't used to be in a low income and have such a need that they're going to have a need now, and they'll be more relatable to the people who have always been in low income or in that type of situation. I don't want to say it's good, but I think maybe some people will realize that, you know, you can be in a low income situation and not have it be your fault. I mean, there's lots of things that make that people hit hard times, and you know, that's what I think everybody's hitting right now. So not that I think there's a lot of good things that have come out of COVID. Personally, my son's at home, so there's little things like that. But maybe this will be one of those things where people can relate a little bit more and say, oh, wow, like, I feel you. I know exactly how it feels to be food insecure or, you know, have my funds diminished and depleted. And there'll be maybe a little bit more understanding, maybe a little bit kinder, hopefully.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it'll increase our community's awareness of the lack of access to certain things. I think sometimes ignorance is bliss, and a lot of us don't necessarily realize that some of our community struggles more than others.
Well, that's what Jen and I were just talking about. You know, people, they have that invisibility because people don't want to know. Because it takes, you know, to reach out to Gadsden Green and do what we're doing takes money, and it takes time, and it takes a mirror for you to go, oh, wow, I'm really not doing what I should be doing for my fellow man.
Yeah.
And so
sorry, this background makes me look like I'm coming down from the heavens or something now.
It looks like you have a tiara.
Okay, I will, hold on one second. Great job, Jenny. I am done with my quiz for you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.